Hello and a warm welcome along to this special Marconi walk. I'm Alan Pumfalon, and as part of Heritage Open Days we have decided to actually record the Marconi walk that normally we actually perform in person. Now we're standing next to what should be an ordinary building, but let's have another look at it, because in fact it's got something really special on it. This is a very special, worldwide famous building. This is where wireless technology, as we know it today, began. This, what was once a silk factory, is in fact the first wireless factory in the world. And the person responsible for it is Mr. Marconi. Mr. Marconi was in the 1890s, in his 20s, and already experimenting with wireless technology. He had obtained all of the books and all the material he could, and he'd read it all, and he started to make his own equipment. He then started to transmit Morse messages to his brother in the next village. He soon realised that this sort of material and this equipment could be used by the Italian Navy, but when he approached them, they showed very little interest. His mother, Amy Jameson, of the well-known Jameson Irish Whiskey Company, suggested that they travel to London. So in 1897 they travelled to London and met up with William Preece of the GPO, and he was very keen on this new ideas that this young Italian had, and could see a great future in it. So they started to then tour the country demonstrating Mr. Marconi's new equipment, and it received a great response. Also at the same time, other people who were really quite influential industrialists also saw that there was an investment to be made here in Mr. Marconi and his equipment, and so it wasn't long before Mr. Marconi felt that he could then go away from the GPO and set a company up on his own. In December 1898, his advisors were looking for a location for a factory here in Chelmsford, and they came across this disused silk mill, which was actually being used as a furniture storage at the time. It was owned by Mr. W.G. Wenley. Mr. Wenley negotiated with Marconi's advisors, and they took out a 25-year lease, which also included Alfred's Cottage, which is just down there, and that became the residence of the on-site caretaker John Reeve. So why did Mr. Marconi's company come to Chelmsford? Well, there's a number of theories that actually fit into this requirement. The first one is that we have Colonel Crompton not far up the road here, and his great electrical industry already established in Chelmsford. So there are people in Chelmsford that are very skilled in electrical work already. The next thing is that it's very flat round here, and so ideal for transmitting signals, wireless signals, across land. The next thing is that there is no tram network in Chelmsford. So no interference from electrical sparks that are flying round on overhead cables. The other reason is that it's just a good distance from London, and so just about far enough away from the GPO. All of those brought us here to Hall Street, and this is where it all happened. And so they started production small, with only a few men and boys working on the ground floor in the machine shop, and then later they brought in ladies to actually wind coils, and these were on the upper floor. The two halves of the company were then making very small spark gap wireless sets, and these they found were quite attractive to the shipping companies, especially the Royal Navy. Mr. Marconi, being the salesman that he is, he actually managed to loan some of these to the Royal Navy, and then they became one of his biggest customers. And that was Mr. Marconi's forte. He was a great salesman. So production was working really well. So well here that in fact at one point in 1905, they decided to move the operation to Dalston in London because there was so much capacity needed and they didn't have it here at Hall Street. Problem was that the Dalston one was very badly managed, and Mr. Marconi ended up sacking the actual operations director and took control of the operation himself and brought the whole thing back to Hall Street in 1908. Here they started to then make the wireless sets that were going to go into shipping, into merchant ships, into Atlantic liners. The Atlantic liners were in fact going to include the Titanic. But in the meantime, Mr. Marconi had employed a very important man, Mr. Godfrey Isaacs, and we will hear a lot more about him later. When Mr. Godfrey Isaacs took over the management of this site, production soon increased, so much so that it even moved to the other side of the road as well. They had army huts here, they had a 210-foot aerial there as well, and this really expanded the company. But in the meantime, Titanic, all the equipment, the radio equipment, the wireless operators, all came from this factory. And so the 732 lives that were saved during the Titanic disaster, they all owe their lives to the equipment that was made in this factory. That really does put Chelmsford on the map, doesn't it? The two radio operators on Titanic were Harold Bride and John Jack Phillips. Both were trained Marconi men of the best quality, and they really were up against it because not only were they using the equipment, they were also maintaining it as well. And so it was quite a feat to run that system, but they did it. And on the night when things really went wrong and Titanic hit that iceberg, they were there, siping out CQD, CQ all stations, D distress. And then on the captain's suggestion, they then started to transmit SOS. They both went down. The ship was really in a bad way, and they both stayed at their post until the very last minute. Then they made it independently off the boat. Both of them dived over the side and in the end ended up at the same collapsible lifeboat, just barely afloat. Only one of them could climb on board, and so Harold Bride, the younger man, chose to do that. John Jack Phillips hung on the outside. He unfortunately suffered from severe hypothermia and died, and never made it to the rescue boat, the RMS Carpathia. And it was Harold Bride that really carried on transmitting even on the Carpathia, and was met by Mr. Marconi 18 hours later in New York. So the people that worked for Mr. Marconi had a social side. And how did they relax? And how did they spend their weekends? Well, this photograph of 1919 really does give a good example of the sort of things that these people were getting involved in. Now, the first thing is obviously that we have the Chelmsford Star Co-op here, and you can see it's in full use, and really quite a popular store. Now over here we have the Regent Theatre. The Regent Theatre actually started as a theatre, but within a very short period of time it had become a cinema. And so this would have been where probably the Marconi workers would have gone for their Saturday night at the Flicks. And on Sunday morning, they would have maybe visited this lovely Westland Methodist church, which once stood by the side of the stone bridge. The other thing that we notice from this photograph is all the people on bicycles. And bicycles was the way to travel around Chelmsford at that time. In fact, in the high street, there were 3 cycle shops, all next to each other, and all well in business. Bicycles were big business then, and maybe they are today too. Okay, we've now arrived at the top of the High Street, Chelmsford High Street, and we're standing in front of the Saracen's Head Hotel. What is this to do with Mr. Marconi? Well, Mr. Marconi, when he was visiting Chelmsford, always likes to stay in the best possible place. So he would pick the best hotels, and he really liked the Saracen's Head Hotel and stayed here a number of times when he was visiting his New Street factory. We recognise that as Chelmsford Civic Society, and so we have funded a blue plaque for Mr. Marconi. And the great thing about this is it even has a little picture of Mr. Marconi there, so you can see him and relate to the man that is connected to this building. The other location, which is at the top of the High Street, is Shire Hall. And the connection with the Marconi Company and Shire Hall was in January 1900. There was an exhibition of manufacturing going on in Shire Hall. And Mr. Marconi, being the showman, hired the ballroom. And in the ballroom he had men in white coats, on one side transmitting Morse messages, on the other side receiving Morse messages. So the public could then stand in the middle of the room and watch this technology happen right in front of their eyes. It must have been a wonder to be able to see this for the first time. Now we have arrived at the New Street factory. Now I mentioned earlier on that the Marconi Company in Hall Street was expanding very, very quickly. Godfrey Isaacs realised that the company needed a new site, and so he negotiated with the church to buy the cricket ground here in New Street. He then had designed this magnificent building. This is 1912. This is just about the same time as the Titanic sank. But Godfrey Isaacs had the vision, with Marconi's backing, of a manufacturing radio city. And the idea was that this site is closely linked to the railway line. And you've just passed under the railway bridge, so you realise how near we are to the railway line. Well, he had the idea of bringing all the goods into the factory and then taking out the finished product the same way, all by rail. In fact, over there on the other side of the road, there was a massive great siding which had already been set up to service Marriage's Mill and also the market in Chelmsford, the cattle market in Chelmsford. But they had timescales to meet. They managed to get the company to build this Cubitt & Son within the space of 17 weeks. And they achieved this even with 1 week for a strike. The reason for the urgency was to coincide with an international radio conference that was going on in London. And Mr. Marconi arranged a special train for the delegates to be brought out to showcase his new factory. And they entered the factory through this lovely big door into the foyer and then started their tour. It must have been a very proud moment for both Mr. Marconi and Godfrey Isaacs. We've now moved on to the 1912 site, and to make sure that people are aware of what actually industrial evolution happened on this site, we have now installed 4 of these information boards. And these information boards tell the story of how this site over 100 years was involved in technology for both wireless, radar and television and many other electrical accomplishments. Godfrey Isaacs really had a great vision. That great vision involved a large number of people, and they all worked on this Marconi site. Now here they started off by making wireless sets. They then went on in World War II to start getting involved in range finding and then radar. The very early days of radar are actually down to this site amongst others. But the people that really made it are really who we should be remembering. The site itself was very flexible and allowed, as we know, railway wagons to come in and unload materials and take product out. But also it was flexible in that when a product needed to be made, a new building could be erected. Now over time those buildings got more and more elaborate, and we know over the far side of the site there was a building 720 with the large wavy roof, one of the biggest in the country at the time. That building took on various guises through its history, and at one point was a canteen, and I remember personally playing badminton in that hall. The ceiling was that high. Later on it became a computer centre as well. And on the other side of the road was a 1938 building which had a curved front on it, and that was the White House. And the White House had the managing director's office on the 3rd floor. But even the windows on that building were curved. It was a remarkable piece of 1938 build. Unfortunately, it now no longer exists. In the development of the site, a lot of the buildings disappeared, but we're really lucky that there are some parts that still remain. And one of those is this wall behind me, and that strange looking beam that goes across it. This was once a carpenter's workshop, and what we're looking at is the inside of the building. And so that's why you can see the beam this side. The wall would have the outside wall would have gone down here, and this area would have been right next to where the railway would have come in, and those wagons would have been shunted to the side of the building on the other side. Now, on the other side of that wall is still camouflage paint from World War II, because when the whole site was preparing for World War II, they decided to camouflage as much of the buildings as they could. And they even created down the middle here a waterway painted blue and boats painted onto it to try and detract that it was a manufacturing city. Did it work? Well, I think the Luftwaffe had inside information, and it would seem that it still got bombed. But it may have saved some of the crucial equipment and some of the people that were working here at the time. Now, another building that does actually still remain is the water tower. And the water tower has again an information board on it, and you can see that actually depicts more of the history of the site. This water tower was part of the sprinkler system that was essential when you're operating at high voltage and fire can happen at any time in a manufacturing facility. So they had top-notch sprinkler systems. They also had their own fire brigade. The fire brigade, the Marconi fire brigade, was better than the local one because it was financed by a business, and the people that actually were firemen were volunteers. They had various vehicles in their time, but we're not sure really where they were stored on the site. But the Marconi firemen were a proud bunch of men, and quite rightly so. During World War II, the Marconi company were also involved in making spy sets, radios that were incorporated into attaché cases and various small devices. The idea of these was that they were going to be dropped behind enemy lines and allow our secret services to communicate back to base. This was all preparation for D-Day. Now, making these sets was no easy feat, and a lady called Florence Attridge was set up in a small secluded area with some very specialist ladies who then made the winding coils for these radio sets. They had to be precise and they had to work every time. And so they worked long hours and they achieved this. Florence, for this work, actually got a British Empire Medal for her work. But also, she was the only person actually supervising the ladies, but dispatching of these special radio sets had to be done again by a specialist staff. And so a lady in the dispatch department, Rosie Mason, was one of the dispatch ladies that ensured that these radios went off to Stonebridge Park in West London, where they were then incorporated into their packages before they were then taken on an aeroplane and maybe dropped behind enemy lines by parachute with their operators attached. We're now on the other side of the site, and we're next to one of the other buildings that still exists, and this is the powerhouse which supplied all the electricity for the manufacturing site. But go back to 1918 and World War I had just finished. But World War I, when it arrived back in England, brought with it the Spanish flu, a pandemic that in the end closed this Marconi manufacturing site. But two engineers, Mr. Round and Mr. Ditcham, decided that they were going to carry on their research, so they loaded all their equipment into a wagon and transported it to Ballybunion in Ireland. There they experimented with the new technology of using wireless to transmit speech. Up until then, wireless was only used for Morse code. So having speech was something really, really new. And while they were experimenting there, they actually managed to transmit across the Atlantic by mistake. But when the pandemic actually finished and they moved back to New Street, they were then looking at how they were going to take that speech technology forward. And their solution was to read Bradshaw's railway timetables over the radio. This then developed into reading the local newspaper, and the radio amateurs that were listening at the time were really enthusiastic by what they'd suddenly heard out of their homemade sets. They reported this back to the Marconi company. The Marconi company felt that they could then take it to the next level, and they decided then to put speech radio in place with singing. They needed a lady's voice to help them sing. Enter into the story a lady called Winifred Sayer, and she was working at the Hoffman's Ball Bearing Company just round the corner. She was singing as an amateur soprano in the evenings in Shire Hall and various other buildings in Chelmsford. They proposed to her that she came and sang for them into their new wireless equipment. She was paid 10 shillings an evening, and she agreed. And because of that, Winifred Sayer became Britain's first paid radio artiste, and her studio was not far from this spot. What she sang into was a telephone receiver with a modified wooden horn on it made from a cigar box. Those transmissions ended up being heard as far away as Norway and by many ships in the North Sea. All this set the scene for later that year in June 1920 for Dame Nellie Melba to come and sing from this site across the globe. She was persuaded here by the sum of around about £1,000 to come to darkest Chelmsford. That's around about £100,000 in today's money. And she arrived here, and Godfrey Isaacs escorted across the site and said to her, "Madam Melba, your voice is going to be heard from those very tall aerials that are being erected on the site." And she was heard to say, "Young man, if you think I'm going all the way up there, you're very much mistaken." But Dame Nellie Melba, as we know, delivered, and she sang 7 songs, and they went out across the globe. How far did they go? Well, we're not really sure, but somehow we heard something in Australia through the static that could have been Dame Nellie Melba. That's how far a transmission from Chelmsford could go in those days. They had immense powerful equipment. And so the story goes on, and that then set the history really for the early days of the BBC and the broadcasts at Writtle by Captain Peter Pembleton Eckersley. He later became the first chief engineer of the BBC. But what of Godfrey Isaacs? Well, Godfrey Isaacs was involved in the very first meeting of the BBC at the General Post Office headquarters near St Paul's in London. He was the guy that came up with the concept of the BBC licence fee. So could it be argued that Godfrey Isaacs was in fact the father of the BBC? Meanwhile, back here, thousands of people in Chelmsford were being employed by the Marconi company. Chelmsford itself grew because of the Marconi company, and at one point there was 24 sites here. What remains today? Well, all we have is the legacy of the Teledyne E2V company. They carry on the Marconi banner, and they are then making exploration equipment to take into space. They are doing cancer research. They are making equipment to treat cancer and detect cancer. Their cameras have recently appeared on Mars and are the reason why we can see the Mars surface so clearly, all down to the cameras made in Chelmsford. So the Marconi legacy lives on, and so does the technology. And that really brings us to the end of this walk, but really says that we should recognise this legacy. The legacy will be recognised this month because the British Science Festival are coming to Chelmsford. Why are they coming here? The first time in their 189 years, because of the Marconi company and all the people that work for it. A real tribute to all that legacy and all that hard work. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed this particular version of the walk. Goodbye.